Okay, welcome to Lesson 10 of the Civil War. In this section, we're going to talk about the Confederate government, but most of our lesson today is going to cover Confederate and Union assets, advantages and disadvantages during the Civil War. Because we're going to be talking about advantages and disadvantages, this leads into a natural discussion of strategies that each side would have to employ during the war in order to accomplish their goals. The North's goal was to keep the Union together. The South's goal was to form their own nation and just be left alone. And so, if the South's goal is to just be left alone, then they don't have to do anything except defend themselves against Northern invasion. The North has to actively win the war. The North has to invade the South, recapture Southern states, and bring them back into the Union by force. And so this is going to lead to how each of these sides carries out this strategy during the war. Now, what you have to keep in mind is that the Confederacy starts the war at a great disadvantage. Historians, since the Civil War, have said that the Confederacy had no chance of winning this war. The South has a lot of big disadvantages going for it when it decides to fight in a war. Now, to maintain a country on its own, it could have maintained a country that was at peace with its neighbors, but there was no way that they were going to win a war in the condition that they were in. So, at the top of page 12 of the new notes, Confederate Assets, they talk about how the Confederacy doesn't need as many troops to fight a defensive war, and all they have to do is hold out and hope that the North cannot be fighting a popular war with its population. If they can get enough people to resist fighting the war, then they can get the Union to give up and just go home and let the South go. The North has to invade and conquer and actively return the South into the Union. The North is fighting, the South is fighting for just self-determination, the ability to rule themselves, and the ability to govern themselves. The big advantage that the South had during the war were its generals. The South had a lot of the army generals and a lot of the army soldiers and cavalry soldiers call the South home. And so, in order to fight a land war, they had a lot of advantages in terms of training of the men and leadership of the men. The South did have a good economic base, but it was an agricultural base. They weren't building much industry. And so without much industry, they wouldn't be able to build the guns that they would need. They wouldn't be able to manufacture the uniforms that they would need, wouldn't be able to even manufacture shoes on a large scale. They had to rely on foreign governments to ship that stuff in. And so when we look at one of the parts of the Northern strategy, that was to take the Navy of the North, which was a great advantage to the North, and surround and blockade the southern ports. If we can make sure that no shipments of guns, if we can make sure that no shipments of finished goods get into the South, then eventually they are not going to be able to fight anymore. The Southern men were good fighters, but without supplies they weren't going to survive. The Confederates didn't have much of a chance because they didn't have much homegrown industry. You couldn't build weapons yourself, you had to rely on those from the outside. And so as you see under Section 5, Part B, as the war dragged on longer and longer, the South doesn't have shoes, uniforms, blankets, and what the North actually does is they try and destroy all of the railroads in the South, so that way, even if they did have supplies, they wouldn't be able to get them to where they were needed. There were only 4 situations in which the South could have won the war, and that's if the border states leave, if the upper Mississippi Valley, such as Missouri, Illinois, some of those western states, leave the Union, Kansas, places like that, because then the North would be cut off from the rest of the country, would be cut off from supplies and money coming from California, and they would be essentially able to divide the northern territories from the northern states. They had to hope that the North would just divide in itself, and that people called Copperheads, who were in favor of just letting the South leave the Union, were able to win a significant voice in the government. That way, they would just call the war quits. And the last chance that they had was for England or France to break the blockade and to bring them supplies. This probably wasn't going to happen. You have a strong Union Navy holding the blockade on all of the southern ports. You have England and France, who are really not that determined to break the Union blockade and to try and help the South. They did want to see the South win, but they also knew that if they made the North angry, then they were going to lose a very, very powerful trading partner. The northern advantages, many. Okay, there's no possible way that the North is going to lose this war. They had 22 million people compared to the South, which only had 9 million people, and only 5.5 million of those people in the South were free whites. And so the South wasn't going to arm their slaves. They were afraid of slaves with guns, so they weren't going to arm their slaves. So the North had far more people than the South did. The North had 3/4 of the money in the nation. The North had 3/4 of the nation's railroad. They could repair and replace equipment very quickly by using the railroads. That was an advantage that the South did not have. And they had large manufacturing centers. And so the Union Army had enough uniforms, had enough shoes, had enough guns, had enough ammunition in order to keep the war going for a very long time. A long war was not what the South needed. And the North also had the Navy. Places like Rhode Island, Connecticut, Massachusetts, that's where you're looking at ships being built, and that's where you're looking at boys growing up in the Navy and becoming strong naval commanders. And so because of the strength of the Union Navy and the ability to blockade all of those southern ports, not allowing any ships in from England or France, the war is going to be won by the North. The rallying cry for the South was states' rights, that each state should be able to determine its own destiny and should be able to determine its own laws. The North is much more divided. The Northerners say, a lot of Northerners said if they want to leave, we can let them. But the idea of keeping the Union together, and for a lot of people, the strong moral issue of fighting slavery, those were going to be the two things that kept the North fighting. That we were all in this together, and we had been for 80 some years at that point, and so you weren't allowed to just pick up and leave because it would make the Union practically worthless. And so fighting for Union, fighting for democracy, and fighting for slaves were going to be the three big issues that is going to bring the Union boys to the war. In terms of the government of the Confederacy, this is another big disadvantage for the Confederacy. They left the Union based on the ability of each state to determine its own destiny and to determine its own laws. When you're trying to fight a war, though, you need a strong central government that can draw resources from multiple states and put them where they're needed. All Jefferson Davis had in terms of a Confederate government was he had a number of states that were looking out for themselves. And so whenever Jefferson Davis tried to exert some power in order to win the wars, he just couldn't. The Constitution of the Confederacy was based largely on the U.S. Constitution, but it made a much stronger provision for states' rights. In fact, at one point, as your notes say, Jefferson Davis was almost impeached because he was trying to exert too much authority, according to those southern states. So we talked about advantages and disadvantages, and we talked about some strategy that the North has to invade the South, but the North is going to win this war, very unlikely for the South.